My name is Bill Roebuck. I'm the Executive Vice President at AGSIW. I want to welcome everyone to the second session. Our second panel today is focused on geopolitical shift and new alliances. So we're going to change the focus just a bit from directly on energy and talk a lot about the geopolitical elements involved, international relations, the dynamics on the ground between these countries and with great powers that come in, China, the United States, Russia, and how that affects the overall dynamics for the energy transition. I want to briefly introduce our panel this morning. First, Ambassador John Herbst. Ambassador Herbst is the Senior Director at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. He's a former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine and to Uzbekistan before that, and he has had many assignments in the State Department and with the Foreign Service. Dawn Murphy is an Associate Professor of National Security Strategy at the National War College. Dr. Murphy specializes in Chinese foreign policy and domestic politics and U.S.-China relations. Paul Salem is President and CEO of the Middle East Institute. He's been widely published, of course, and is widely quoted on range of issues on regional and international relations of the region in the Middle East. Our moderator today is Hussein Ibish. Hussein is a senior resident scholar at AGSIW, and he'll be leading our panel today. Hussein, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Roebuck. I really appreciate it. And I want to thank the panelists for joining us today to look at geopolitical shifts and new alliances, which is, a pretty vague idea. But I think the way I understand it, and I think the way we mean it, is how do we interpret the increasing role of new global powers or reasserting global powers in the Gulf region, in the Middle East, and with regard to energy markets there, specifically Russia and China. And I think we just should be straightforward about that. So what has led to the reemergence of a Russian and the emergence of a Chinese role in the Gulf region? Well, first and foremost, it's more than a decade of drift away from the U.S., many of its key security partners in the region. And this would certainly include Israel, as well as, in our case, most importantly, Saudi Arabia and the UAE. There are many causes. You could date this from the Arab point of view probably all the way back to the failure of the Camp David summit between Israel and the Palestinians in 2000, which raised questions about the real effectiveness of the United States and the impact of its domestic politics on its ability to influence, to exercise what it said was its will. There were these other key inflection points more recently, like Barack Obama's red line decision, where he did not enforce his stated red line on chemical weapons, and instead was perceived as rewarding Bashar al-Assad with an agreement that tacitly acknowledged his authority and also implied that he needed to keep control of all of the parts of Syria necessary to ship the stuff that he was supposed to get rid of out of the country. So it really was sort of a gift to him in a way. I mean, he came out the big winner without any doubt. And not just that he didn't get attacked, but he actually pocketed a lot of benefits. Then you have sort of the JCPOA, the negotiations of the Iran deal, then Trump going out of the Iran deal in a way that I think that many of the Arab countries were not that pleased with, and they would have preferred a different approach. And then you get, as a result of that, 2 years of maximum pressure and a year of maximum resistance. And the year of maximum resistance kind of, I think, reminded these countries of two things. Their vulnerability and lack, especially the UAE, lack of strategic depth, and a vulnerability to air and missile attacks, the power of Iran's missile arsenal and drone arsenal and hyper-precision guidance systems, right? So they're very, very vulnerable. And the United States not responding. And two incidents particularly hit the key Gulf partners hard. The September 2019, Abqaiq and Khores, as you once said, if that's how they're pronounced, which I thought was great and true. Attacks kind of really raised alarm bells in Saudi Arabia because Donald Trump was not only didn't act, he was very cavalier about it. He sort of said, well, no Americans died, no one attacked us, what the heck, and moved on. For the UAE, of course, it was the Houthi drone and rocket attacks that killed a couple of workers near Abu Dhabi in January of 2021, at the beginning of the Biden administration's term. And in that case, it wasn't quite so cavalier, but even the Biden administration admits it was tardy, and the UAE continues to say insufficient as well. So you've got there real doubts about the reliability of the United States, and what there's no doubt that the U.S. has this big military footprint in the region, but what would trigger its use? There's a real question mark. We are no longer in the days of the Carter Doctrine and fears about tank divisions rolling in. It's much different now and much more complex. All of that provides the opening for other powers because these countries started to emphasize strategic diversification. They started to reach out to Russia and China to diversify their options, and they started to reach out to each other, as in the Abraham Accords, a good example, but there are many others, and take diplomatic initiatives independent of the United States. So you've got these kind of realignments going on as a result of both the rise of a multipolar reality that the United States really can't prevent, and doubts about U.S. intentions and U.S. policy over time. In addition, you've got the emergence of Russia as perceived to be a reliable partner in Syria. Bloodthirsty, no doubt, ruthless, no doubt, but they intervened decisively to save Bashar al-Assad along with Iran and Hezbollah in the fall of 2015, and they succeeded. And this was seen, especially before the Ukraine invasion, as in contrast to the United States. They also emerged over the past decade as the go-to interlocutor, the role the United States had in the region after the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, where everyone wanted to talk to the United States to resolve things. These days, the United States doesn't talk to so many parties that it can't be party to many of the key conversations. And Russia steps in and really takes that role. And now we see China also brokering and playing that role as well. And finally, with Russia, OPEC+, which is the hinge for Saudi Arabia, the cornerstone of its economic policy, and because of the Ukraine war, a real potential irritant between Washington and Riyadh. And I'm sure we'll talk a lot about that. China's emergence is very strong in diplomacy and politics, but it strikes me as potentially limited in terms of its ambition. It may be, and I'm going to ask you about this in my first question to you, it may be that Chinese ambitions in the Gulf are a lot less than many Gulf Arabs hope and many Americans fear. So we'll talk about that. And I'd like to begin by asking Ambassador Herbst to talk about the Russian role here, not just OPEC+, but in general, the role of Russia in the Gulf region with regard to energy, and certainly OPEC+, please.
Thank you. But I may want to say something first about the overall position of the United States in the Middle East. I think that your framing was excellent, and I don't quarrel with any of it. But I think an important reason for the dissatisfaction with American policy, which goes back certainly to the Obama administration, is inconsistent, unenergetic, and overall not particularly competent leadership. I mean, you gave a list of examples of the September 19 attack and the absence of response, the January 21 attack, same thing. Although I think, well, the United States was very attractive to the Gulf for decades because our leadership was strong, consistent, and energetic. That will return at some point, although not until after the next election, maybe even not then. So I'm just pointing that out. And also for those who are invested in closer Russian-Chinese ties, keep in mind their vulnerabilities. You're seeing the Russian vulnerabilities right now. Chinese, you're also seeing, although not quite as clearly, the demographic problem. And I think the fall in Chinese economic production, if the United States continues to make sure it's more difficult for them to steal American technology or to insist on American technology as part of American companies engaging in China. Okay, now in Russia. You're right that Russia has been seen as a consistent, strong, and within its own guidelines, with its policy interests, reliable partner. I say within its own guidelines because there are many Arab states that are not enthusiastic about Bashar al-Assad, and that's especially true in the 2015, 2014, as Moscow began, actually it was 2015 that Moscow made its bones in the Middle East with its ramp up. But you're seeing in Ukraine, and you're seeing on the streets of Rostov-on-Don the weaknesses in the Russian system, which should give pause for anyone relying on Moscow. I believe that Russian weapons are being sold at a discount now to what they were before we sent HIMARS to Ukraine with a range of 85 kilometers about this time last year. And you can be sure the Chinese are taking a second look at their plans to move across the Taiwan Straits because of that. Russian policy in the Middle East has been consistent. They have been seeking since at least, I think you could actually put this back to 2014, 2015, as things in Syria got more interesting, to restore the position they had in Soviet days. And they've done that principally by strong support for Bashar al-Assad, by the way, which has been partly successful in part, well, it's been successful in part because while they were boosting Assad, we were taking out ISIS. Right. So they benefited from our focus on ISIS. They also benefited from what I would call the overall sensible, but in practice, not well executed instincts of the Obama administration to avoid another major engagement in the Middle East, meaning Syria. Obama set that red line down because he was trying to fend off pressure from Congress to intervene on behalf of opponents of Assad who probably had some jihadi connotations, and of course those who did not had no real wusta on the battlefield. Moscow, though, of course, went beyond Syria to, I have to say, a somewhat successful diplomatic outreach to Egypt as we fussed with the government there over human rights practices and the absence of democratic practices. In Libya, where they work with the general against the UN-approved leader. And of course, they've worked the Gulf well, in part because of Saudi and UAE disaffection. With first the Iran deal, then, actually my sense is, but I'm willing to be corrected, that they kind of got along kind of like Trump. No one likes the way he would move from one end of the table to another, but they liked the overall thrust of his policies. And of course, the Abraham Accords were partly made or substantially made in the Trump White House. But the absence of a reliable American lodestar made Russia a desirable friend. I think the UAE, however, has placed itself in a somewhat vulnerable position right now by helping Russia get around sanctions, and especially by sending substantial portions of high-tech components into Russia, which can be used for weapon systems. I think that a certain caution there might be in order. And here I come back to where I started. The high water point of marching authoritarians was the Xi-Putin meeting 3 weeks before Putin went large into Ukraine. Since then, Putin's problems only grow. Xi's been embarrassed by that partnership and not walked away from it. And of course, when he kind of doubled down when he visited Moscow late this winter and talked about the amazing things to come from the world would see from Russia, China, well, the only amazing things we've seen is Prigozhin marching on Moscow. So keep in mind the United States is coming back, albeit when, I'm not certain, because I'm not too enthusiastic about either possible president in 2025. Okay, I think I've probably said enough, except one last point. The one reason for Saudi attraction, or rather why they find the Russians attractive, as you mentioned, Hussein, is, of course, OPEC Plus. And that attractiveness was actually for one of the achievements of the Trump administration, unleashing American hydrocarbon production, which Biden promptly shackled, creating all sorts of geopolitical problems for us that we had to and then still have to deal with. I think this may well be a source of tension going forward, so I suspect the shackling that we're seeing today will be changed at some point in the not-too-distant future. Although if Biden wins a second term, we'll have to wait after that. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you for those extremely insightful remarks. I thought that was great.
Oh, can I just mention one more thing?
Yeah. Sure.
I spent almost half my career in the Middle East, and you noted the Camp David Summit, Camp David II.
Yep.
I had the privilege, if you want to call it that, of being the least important member of the American delegation there as the Consul General in Jerusalem. Anyway, thank you.
Oh. Wow. Okay. With that, let me turn to Professor Murphy, if I may. And it's a simple question. Can you describe kind of the scope of China's rise in the region, its evolution beyond merely the buying and selling of energy, right? So that it is its new diplomatic, political, commercial, infrastructural role, whatever you want to ascribe to it. And also, if you could talk a little bit about my instinct, that I don't know, but my instinct that Arab hopes and American fears about China's ambitions in the Gulf are both sort of wildly overblown. And I'd like you to kind of address that idea, if you would.
So first, thanks for having me here today. And I need to give my standard disclaimer that the views I express today are my own. They do not represent the National War College, Department of Defense, or the U.S. government more broadly. The way I would describe China's role in the Middle East broadly, but the Gulf, the Arab Gulf in particular as well, it's really been a linear progression ever since the end of the Cold War, but really from 2000 forward. China has been building robust economic and political, primarily, relations through a number of different tools, whether that be the China Arab States Cooperation Forum that was established in 2004, the special envoy that they set up to try to contribute to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in 2002, the free trade agreement they've been negotiating with the Gulf Cooperation Council since 2004, the special envoy for Syria that was established in 2016. Most recently, I'm sure you saw in the news, regarding the Iran-Saudi deal that was brokered earlier this year. So I see it very much as a linear progression in the economic and political space primarily. that over the last year and a half, though, I do think that there's been a more public role. Because I think you can argue that there's been this very deep foundation of relations. But in the last year and a half or so, you've seen a much more public appearance, for example, with Xi Jinping visiting Saudi in December last year for a bilateral meeting, as well as to attend the China-Arab States Cooperation Forum and for a GCC-China summit in that meeting, right? As well as the deal that I've already mentioned. The primary drivers for China's relations, I would say over those 20 plus years, as well as today, are for resources as well as markets. And I do think it's really important to emphasize that especially the Arab Gulf, I think they see the opportunities to sell their goods and services, but also for various types of cooperation in health, digital, artificial intelligence, green technology. Many different functional areas are becoming increasingly important in the Gulf. They also want to have support from the Arab Gulf as well as the rest of the Middle East and the rest of the Global South, for that matter, in international organizations, whether that's the UN, the World Trade Organization, other international organizations. They also seek to have relative silence from Arab states and Muslim majority states more broadly throughout the Global South regarding their behavior in Xinjiang. That's another driver. There's a number of other interests that I won't go into, but those are some of the primary drivers. And I would point out for you that historically, if you go back to the 2000s, right, I would say that China equally valued within the Arab world North Africa and the Arab Gulf. But since the Arab awakening, you've definitely been having a shifting towards an emphasis on the Arab Gulf, I would say for a number of reasons. One is obviously the resources that come out of that region, but the stability of those states in the Arab Gulf compared to North Africa has made it a more attractive market in many ways for the Chinese. To your question regarding China's ambitions and what that could mean. So I've been describing a lot of economic and political interaction. The security piece tends to be much more minimal, engaged in peacekeeping operations or anti-piracy off the Gulf of Aden, low levels of conventional arms sales, et cetera. There's no indication at this point that China wants to play the type of security role that the U.S. does in the region. And China, over many years, has had a very explicit no foreign basing policy. Djibouti was their first declared base. Obviously, there's a lot of features in the South China Sea that are very base-like, right? But there's not a lot of indications that they want to play a significantly enhanced security role similar to the U.S.'s, right? That said, as relations between the U.S. and China sour, as relations between China and Western Europe sour, the Global South, and arguably the Arab Gulf, is becoming more and more important for markets, for political cooperation, for these types of interactions going forward. So I do think that they see this smaller subregion as well as the broader Middle East as a really important region for future cooperation. So kind of back to your questions, I think it depends on how you define threatening it to whose interests. And, so I think that they have deep aspirations for a significant role in the region.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Murphy. Now I'd like to turn to Dr. Salem and ask about, of course, the regional response to the reemergence of Russia as a major player and the emergence of China as a stronger player beyond just being a customer, but also how these countries in the Gulf are triangulating the relation with the United States. And I'll just throw out one idea. It seems to me that Saudi Arabia in particular has been very careful not to cross an American unstated red line about not providing Beijing with any undue additional strategic foothold in the region. But all the agreements that have been signed during the Xi visit, before it, and now after it, at this major investment conference they just had, they simply didn't do it. Then nothing they signed raised those security alarm bells in Washington. It strikes me as very significant. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on all of this.
Yeah, thank you, Hussein, and it's lovely to be here. How are the states of the region looking at these great powers? I think in terms of the U.S. and the Gulf in particular, the U.S.'s policies and its interests have shifted and have changed. You mentioned, obviously, basically the end of the Carter Doctrine. It's no longer the case that the U.S. needs to go to war to protect energy interests. It has its own. Of course, they have interests in global energy prices. But the willingness of the U.S. to go to war, especially after the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, is basically close to zero. The hyper concern about counterterrorism, which drove a major surge of presence in the region, Afghanistan and Iraq, is now a fourth, fifth order concern. It's no longer driving U.S. concern about the region. Even the concern about Iran, which remains there, but it's no longer a driving concern. For the U.S., the region has declined in strategic importance. It remains an interest, and there's enduring interest there, but it's no longer at the top of the line. The region has read this decline in sort of engagement, decline in presence. You add to that leadership issues that I think the ambassador mentioned, Obama's problems sort of with leaders in the region. They like Trump, but they didn't get much in terms of defense from Trump. Saudi was attacked, not much happened. They don't like Biden, that's pretty obvious. In this region, personal relationships matter tremendously, and that could be recouped, as the ambassador said, maybe in future administrations. But I think the more profound difference strategically between the U.S. and all of its partners in the region is that today the U.S. identifies its main adversaries as China and Russia. There is no country in the Middle East which agrees that China or Russia is their adversary. Right. During the Cold War, there was agreement. Soviet Union, communism is an adversary. Iran is an adversary. Terrorism is an adversary. So we are at an inflection point in U.S. Gulf, U.S. Israeli, U.S. Turkish, name, call it what you were. We are completely on different pages in terms of the strategic priority, and that comes out in a lot of the differences that we see. Having said that, I mean, when you look at the world, let's call it, you have to look at, I would say, different levels. At the strategic security level, it still is largely a unipolar world. Right. And I think that's reflected in what, Dawn mentioned and so on. Fareed Zakaria mentioned in an article 2-3 weeks ago, he said, the U.S. has, from his article, 700 military bases abroad. China has 1. We have 50 allies. They have 1. So let's not, freak out too much. Neither Russia nor China offer our partners a security partnership or a strategic. They just don't have it. They're not interested. They don't have the wherewithal. And they couldn't if they don't want to, and they couldn't if they want to. So at the strategic security level, the U.S. remains the only major game in town, except that all of our partners want to be multipolar in their dating and in their relationships. And that's clearly obvious that while we remain the main security partner, China is the main economic partner. And by economic, that also includes a lot of technology. It's not a word that summarizes a lot of things, and getting deeper over time. The U.S. awakened to this Chinese, call it, menace, threat, the hyperventilating about it. Certainly Trump maybe took it to a high level, and then the Biden administration continued. But if you look at U.S. and Chinese interests in the Middle East, they actually overlap. U.S. and China want free flow of trade. U.S. and China want free flow of energy and calm energy markets. U.S. and China don't want, I have similar counterterrorism concerns. They both don't want the spread of nuclear weapons. They both want de-escalation. They both want stability. So what's interesting is that the U.S. and China in the Middle East actually have overwhelmingly shared interests. What they're fighting about is the future. The U.S. is worried that, all these things China do, they look innocuous, but maybe in 2040 they're going to turn the global tables on us, and we shouldn't let them get ahead. China, similarly, in their opposition to the U.S., it's because they interpret American strategy in the Middle East and anywhere around the world as seeking to harm them. And when they look at, U.S. presence in the Middle East, it's not lost to them that half of their energy comes through the Persian Gulf. It's not lost that the Fifth Fleet controls that energy. So if there's ever a dust-up between the U.S. and China, America's presence in the Gulf is going to be cripplingly important. So that indicates a policy question that given all the common interests in the present, why are we pitching all policy that, well, we're going to fight in 2040, so we may as well start fighting now. I'll end with a few comments about Russia, and I agree with everything the ambassador said. Just put out a piece yesterday, if the Prigozhin thing played out completely, and it looked to me like a Sudan scenario, a government-backed militia gets out of hand and then you go towards civil war. But, if that played out and the, Putin-led order collapsed, how would that, who would be most alarmed? Obviously, it's, Iran and Syria. They're the only ones with strategic dependence. Everybody else has relations, but nobody is, it's not the old Soviet days when the collapse of the Soviet Union was a huge thing. So it would have limited effects. The region itself is become much more self-determinative. In other words, it's making its own decisions at all levels. This is not the Middle East of the 1960s or 1970s where everybody was a client of some great power. That's no longer the case. The leaders in the region, Erdogan or MBS or MBZ, they see themselves as global leaders and charting their own course. Obviously, the Iranians in their own way, and the region and Israel for a long time has been of that direction. And as they've seen that the U.S. can no longer, for our partners, can no longer protect them. Israel discovered that a while ago vis-a-vis Hezbollah. Saudi Arabia and the Emirates discovered it on their own terms. And as a parenthesis here, it's not so much that the U.S. wasn't willing or wasn't there or didn't make the phone call, although, those are sore spots. But the way Iran has developed its asymmetric warfare, Israel, with all the support in the world and all the technology, cannot defend against 20,000 missile strikes from Hezbollah. Just can't do it. So there's a technological vulnerability that Saudi Arabia and the Emirates are now aware of, and it's not because the U.S. isn't there. It is there with all the equipment at its, but simply the weapons against each other will not prevent breakthroughs. Only deterrence, only de-escalation, peacemaking, let's be friends, that kind of thing. But the region definitely is reshaping itself. The Gulf countries, Jordan, Israel, Egypt, Morocco, U.S. are one alignment, and I think Saudi Arabia is going to move into that sooner or later more clearly. Yep. And then you have the Iranian, zone, which is Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen. I think the Iranians think they're on winners in this case, that they got Saudi Arabia to come to them and the UAE to come to them. They're winners, but they're sort of losers in the big picture. It's not a winning empire. But I think they're doubling down on this, approach of theirs. And then you have Turkey in its own kind of sphere, a slightly different zone. So the region is, shaping itself. And the first one that we talked about, GCC, Israel, Egypt, Morocco, if you want, is hugely plugged in to the global economy and the global order, obviously global energy, and they see themselves as shapers of that future, certainly the hydrocarbon present, but also the energy transition that they're going to be drivers. It's not lost on them that they have the biggest amounts of capital to spend in the world, rivaling that of China and certainly rivaling that of the West. So they are now a third power in the world, and they're flexing those muscles. Thanks.
Great. Thanks for that very good tour d'horizon of the region. Wonderful. So Ambassador Herbst has to go in about 10 minutes, I'm afraid, and we want to honor that commitment. So I just want to ask you to give us, first of all, whatever closing thoughts you have, because you're going to go. But in particular, before that, I'd like you to address the impact of the Ukraine war on Russia's role in the region. Because it strikes me that OPEC Plus is there. It's more of an irritant between Riyadh and Washington than Moscow's problem. But the Ukraine war has been, I think it's fair to say, a real fiasco in real time and in public view. And it has to have had a significant impact, even though all these countries, including Israel, Saudi UAE, have been trying hard to maintain ties with Russia as well as the United States and what have you. Still, it must have had a significant impact. And if you could talk about that and then anything else you'd like to say before you go, and the next 10 minutes are yours.
Thank you. In the short run, the only impact that I see it having on the relationship of Russia with the Arab states and Israel is they have to maneuver to avoid coming under sanctions in the case of certain Arab countries, especially the UAE. And in the case of Israel, it has a different problem because it always sold itself in Washington and the United States as the avatar of democracy in the Middle East. And here they are, they've been closer to the big aggressor against the emerging democracy in Ukraine. And there's been some tension in their relationship, in their policy as a result of that. Although, of course, Putin made it easier for them to move in the right direction when he clamped down on Jewish immigration, which became a political issue within Israel. But there is, I think, a longer-term impact that will play out. I sense that, you've had 20 years of bad American foreign policy in the greater Middle East, and that created very serious doubts about the United States as a partner. And now I think people are seeing at least 16 months of bad Russian foreign policy or national security policy in Europe. And along with that, because the Arab world has not had a stake in that, as already mentioned, they've seen the inadequacy of Russian arms. And they've seen, once again, the value of American arms. And for those worried about the security, that's an important consideration. Over time, that will play out. And if we see the return of stronger, more consistent American leadership, there will be real adjustments that follow. But that if is a real if. My confidence is only in the long run, not in the middle term. I don't believe that in terms of Russian activity, the war in Ukraine has had serious impact on their approach in the Middle East, with one exception. And here's where I may disagree with some things that have been said. I don't see Iran now as simply a client of Russia. Because of Kremlin troubles creating its own arms, partly a result of our sanctions and especially our ex-import controls, they've been relying on Iranian drones, which is one of the reasons why Iran seems to be in a position to get access to Russian technology, which before was off limits. So that's a concrete change. But other than that, on a day-to-day basis, I think that the region, different countries for different reasons, still see gain from working with Moscow in ways that they're not working with us. So the boat will turn around, but only over time. And Wagner continues. One of the things that we've been watching is to see if Wagner has drawn down any forces from Syria or Libya, or for that matter, from Africa, as a result of what's happening in Ukraine, or now what's happening in Russia. And the answer to that is no. That doesn't mean that what we see is everything. So something may be happening which is not visible. But those are kinds of self-perpetuating enterprises because there's profit to be gained, which demonstrates one of the reasons why they have longevity. But also it says they're not simply about Russian national security policy as dictated by the Kremlin, although they are about that too. That's basically what I have. Thank you.
All right, that's great. Thank you for joining us. I'm glad we were able to let you go in time. I'd like to turn back to Professor Murphy, if I may, and ask you whether you detect, or I mean, obviously it's there, but how would you characterize, is a better way of putting it, the way in which different key Gulf Arab countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, are reacting to China's increased role in the Gulf region? Because I see a lot of differences. From a Chinese point of view, how do they, and I'm going to ask Paul the same question from the Gulf Arab point of view and these countries, but from a Chinese point of view, how do they look at those differences? How do they respond to them? How do they interpret that?
So I would say, I think in some ways this is a fluid situation that's evolving quite quickly, right? But I'll give two examples of, I think, differences, and part of this is based on some research and interviewing I was doing in the fall and looking at this. But for example, with the Emirates, I would argue that China does not explicitly come out and say this, but of the Arab Gulf states, the Emirates potentially is the most important to China in the longer term in looking at opportunities for economic cooperation, whether it be technology or finance or funding, in many different aspects, right? So, and not by a long shot as far as, but I do think the UAE, if I had to be pinned down on one country, that would be the most important. That said, the relationship with Saudi is expanding into many other areas, right? So, in the Gulf, obviously, those two countries, for a number of reasons, are the most important. When, in my own interviewing, thinking through the differences in the approach, I think the Emirates is, for the reasons you've already mentioned, especially the attacks that occurred early last year, together with a number of concerns and the perception of the U.S. having less of a role in the region. And I do emphasize perception because I think we could have a very long discussion about that. I think the Emiratis increasingly are reflecting on their relationship with China, with the U.S., with other powers, and really thinking through what those relationships look like in the longer term, right? Where on the Saudi side, I would say that I think there is much more of a desire to continue the security relationship with the U.S., but with the acknowledgement that on the economic and political front, increasingly China is the most important partner. When you look at many different metrics, China is, right, the most important. So I think you're having this type of reflection. But within the GCC itself, if you think through this, China has strategic partnerships with almost every country in the GCC, right? As well as with Iran and Turkey, and having very robust relations with Israel, et cetera, right? So it's not just the UAE and Saudi, it is, Kuwait and Qatar, et cetera, that they value those relations. And I do think you've seen more and more emphasis on the GCC. So I think all of the countries in the region, because of the economic relationship, are thinking through what that looks like in the longer term. And that's probably one of the biggest shifts that I've seen, especially in the last few years. But China, as I said earlier, I think increasingly China sees this as a very important region as its relations with other regions become more frayed. And they think through, in the longer term, if there's not going to be the strong, robust relationship that they have with the U.S. or Western Europe, these are even more important countries.
Right. Great answer. And I'd like to ask Paul to sort of give us Gulf Arab. And how do you think the Gulf Arab countries interpret their own differences, or why do they have these differences? I think really Professor Murphy gave a very acute and a very subtly phrased account of the differences between Saudi Arabia and the UAE, regarding China and the United States, which is striking to me. And so I'd like you to kind of chime in on that. And in the context, please, of their renegotiation of the terms of the strategic relations with the United States, which I think is what is going on here.
Yeah, I mean, a number of things to maybe add into our discussion, which we haven't already. One is the politics between the Gulf and the U.S. from the Arab uprisings, Arab Spring period, which had a number of dynamics. One, sort of the U.S. obviously didn't do much, but sort of being more sympathetic to the uprisings and revolutions and so on, which then continues into pro-democracy and all of that up to this administration. But obviously also, and this was mentioned in the case of Syria, not standing by longtime allies like Mubarak and so on. So a conclusion from the Gulf countries that the U.S., even if it is still their strategic partner, is not going to protect them or defend them as governments or regimes, as systems, and that they're not going to be defended externally, upcake and the attacks there. So a real realization that this is still the partner, but we're going to have to take care of ourselves, and hence we'll make our own decisions. The politics has continued and became very partisan, similar to sort of Netanyahu's relationship with the United States. It's become allied with Republicans, opposed to Democrats. It's become like that. And that has poisoned and destabilized the relationship further. You take to the current administration, the president clearly despises the partners and he won't shake hands, he won't talk to them. I mean, and that is so destabilizing for a relationship and a partnership. And the war in Ukraine, yes, brought the U.S. back to the region because of energy and all of other things, but also that conflict has been framed in terms of democracy against autocracy rather than sovereignty, rule of law, and so on, and by definition puts the Gulf countries on so the wrong side from the U.S. side. So what I say about all this politics is that obviously Gulf leaders, when they meet with Putin or Xi, it resonates politically with them in terms of their approach to politics very powerfully, whereas there's a huge, whatever the opposite dissonance, there's a huge dissonance in the way particularly the democratic administrations project, which I understand, and I'm pro-democracy and all of that, but it really, really politically resonates very, very badly. On the positive side of the ledger, the Gulf countries are part of you go to the Gulf, everybody goes to the Gulf. Almost every person you meet there of any, responsibility studied in the U.S., speaks English, their kids are in the U.S., they will live in the U.S., they have houses in London, houses in California or wherever. So the educational, cultural, social, for generations, is part of the West. It is not Chinese, and it's not Russian, and it's not going to be, at least in, I don't know, maybe by 2080, maybe. That's a huge soft power advantage that the U.S. and the West has with the Gulf, and the Gulf is part of that. It's not part of China or part of a Russian sphere. A third advantage that's becoming clearer now is that in terms of business investment and business relations, the Gulf countries, they do business with China because that's where they sell their energy, and they'll buy things from China. But they can't really invest in China. It is not an environment that's open for proper investment, nor can they invest in Russia. So when you look at the sovereign wealth funds, all these trillions of dollars of excess, where is much of it being invested? Where is it's Europe and the United States? Just because these are markets that you can actually invest in, there's a judiciary, you know where you're going, they're reliable, they're transparent. That is another huge advantage. A fourth advantage that I think is beginning to become clearer, was mentioned a little bit in this session, but it will still play out, is that yes, they want to hedge between the US and Russia and China. The equipment of the Russians proved, laughably not up to American or Western standards. And this is the Russian army has fought a lot of wars. Yeah. Chinese army hasn't fought any wars. and Chinese military equipment is nowhere near being competitive. So there's that. On the technological side, what the Biden administration done is revolutionary. I mean, the U.S. has been basically helping China for the last 50 years. Finally said, well, maybe we should stop and begin doing things at home. And although China did make a lot of headway and is still, very advanced in many areas, it's also not lost on the Gulf that technology is invented in the U.S. The Chinese do it well, the Japanese do it well, but the Googles, the Facebooks, the OpenAI, all of this innovation, the university system, it is in the U.S. and it's not in Guangzhou or Shanghai. So, in a way, we might be in a moment where, a lot depends on what happens between now and 2040. It might be kind of a sort of a Japanese moment in the 70s. We thought Japan was going to take over the world, and there's been a fear about China. And I think the Gulf is hedging that. If China ends up being the global power in 2040, we better have good relations with it, so we'll be ready to jump ship. But the way the U.S. is playing it with the Biden administration is the right way to go about it so that China doesn't get to that global advantage. And the U.S. is very well placed in the Gulf, and China really doesn't have that advantage.
Well, without a doubt.
Sorry for going on.
No. It's all true, so it's helpful. Right now, I'm going to throw everything out to the floor because I think it's time, and I'd like to invite Ambassador Salem, the president of AGSIW, to begin. And anyone else who has a question, I guess put your name plate sideways, or raise your hand, or jump up and down, or get my attention. And the floor could be yours.
I've got what I hope will be a quick question for Paul and then for Dawn. I've been struck by the way that the government of the UAE has looked at the development of new, different sets of relationships around the world. Where we have often talked in U.S. academia of a multipolar world, they're talking about a networked world, where everybody has networks of relations with everybody else, where it makes the most sense. The United States, in one corner of the security world, maritime security, has tried to put together a new networked maritime security system, which virtually everybody except the Emirates has signed up to, it seems. My real question is, Paul, for you, do you have a sense for what this networked world means, and can the Emirates and other countries accept the United States as a dominant or very serious partner in the networked world? And for Dawn, from a Chinese standpoint, is the government in Beijing, is Xi flexible enough to figure out what pieces of the relationship China can work on now, put things off later, and calibrate the relationships, or do they have too simplistic and direct approach, particularly in the Middle East?
Well, that's a very fascinating way of putting it, Ambassador Salem. Looking at networks rather than sort of poles and so on. And definitely, I think that's the way the UAE views the world. They are a hub nation like Singapore. They want to be the hub of many, many different networks. And in these networks, it doesn't make sense to speak in 19th century terms as if there's, three great powers and everything revolves around them. But it also sort of unpacks what I was saying, that in the security realm, there's one system. In sale of energy, it's another system. In technology, it's a third system. In logistics, it's a fourth system. In maritime security, it's a fifth system. It's a multi-layered world rather than a multipolar world, let alone talking about, the digital world that was mentioned in the first session, which is big and getting bigger and has its own, structures. And the great powers in the digital world are not any country. They are the companies, the private companies that control all the data, and it's not the U.S. government, maybe the Chinese government in a way. So yeah, I'm very kind of sympathetic to that point of view because it gives you the actual layers that need to take place. And I think what the Gulf countries are trying to convince the U.S. to do is look at it that way as well. And that rather than looking at it in the 19th century, you're with us or against us. If you do anything with China, that means you're our enemies. Rather unpack it and say, okay, security, we get it. You're worried about that, but China's not building a naval presence, military presence, air force. It's not doing it. So why are you worried about when we, sell energy? Let's unpack it. Let's deal with every network on its own terms and not in these sort of simplistic ways that first the Trump administration and the early days of the Biden administration took it. I think the Biden administration and the Chinese are beginning to say, well, let's back away from this black and white approach and maybe let's begin unpacking and talking. Where do we cooperate? Where do we legitimately compete? Where do we go to, have a proxy war? Occasionally that happens. How do we manage it?
What's a proxy war between friends? Yeah. Exactly. Right, yeah. Professor Murphy.
So the way I look at it, two different sides of it. On the calibration piece, in the economic and political space in particular, I think the Chinese, to date at least, their behavior has been, I think, incredibly responsive to the needs and desires of countries in the region, in the GCC. So going back a very long ways, I think they see their interaction, for example, as being supportive of the various Vision 2030 type of plans, right? I think they try to listen to what countries in this region are wanting to do and to partner with them on a very broad range of projects, and that as there is criticism, whether that's around the quality of construction or meeting deliverables or other, I think that they are quite responsive to that, at least behind closed doors, and thinking through with all of these countries, not just Saudi and the Emirates, but I think more broadly. And I think they've tried very hard to maintain relations, positive relations with every country in the Middle East, but particularly in the GCC, to try to have a very balanced approach in various ways. So that's in the economic and political sphere. And I would note on that as well, increasingly, they're pulling the GCC into some other regional configurations. So, for example, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, after Iran has joined as a formal member, Turkey is pursuing membership. Now, all of the GCC, except for Oman, are either dialogue partners or in the process of becoming that. Or with the BRICS, they're increasingly pulling GCC countries into the BRICS, right? So, and I think part of that may be driven obviously by the desires of countries in the GCC itself. So I think they're calibrating. That said, on the security side, I think they still very much see formal alliances, defense treaties, or playing a more robust security role as not being in their own interests in this region or globally, because they don't want to get pulled into conflict. I didn't mention this earlier, but another important interest for theirs in the region is not wanting to have their citizens or businesses targeted by terrorist attacks or towards other violence, right? And so I think they see having a more robust security role, as long as the current state of the international system persists, them having more of a security role, it's almost all downside for them. It makes them more of a target. It forces them to pick sides. They don't want to be pulled into these things. So I think that they're calibrating in a very sophisticated way on the economic and political side. But in the security space, I think for the most part, they are being very careful about how they engage.
I'd like to say something before we go to the next question or comment from the floor, which is that I think you point to something really important here for the Gulf Arab countries' relations with the United States, which is maritime security. I think maritime security is sort of the key, the most manifest iteration of what is an emerging new relationship that is nothing to do with any, even if oil for security was a caricature reduction, it's nothing to do with that. It's security for security. Security where? Security in the waters of the Gulf, of the Arabian Sea, and the Red Sea. Security in the three great choke points, the Suez Canal, Bab el-Mandeb, and the Strait of Hormuz. That is an American trump card in great power competition with China, as Paul mentioned, China's dependence on what comes through those choke points, and also what goes out from China through those choke points. It's crucial to the American global sort of strategic advantage. But it's also crucial to Gulf Arab countries, to their security, to their ability to trade, to their ability to import what they need, etc. So I wanted to make that point. I think people overlook or they don't appreciate the significance of the progress the United States has quietly made in drawing its partners together on maritime security in these areas. So we have a question here or a comment, whatever you want to do, and then we'll come to you, Ambassador.
So, Doug Hengel, I'm a former American diplomat, and among other things, I teach a Geopolitics of Energy course at Johns Hopkins SAIS. So, I guess one suggestion I wanted to make is if we could, in the remaining time, have a little bit of a conversation about OPEC Plus and the future of that, because I think there's a fair amount of expertise in the room.
Yeah.
If Adam Szyminski wants to exclude himself from that conversation.
It's an invitation
well,
to
it's
comment?
an invitation to the moderator to
Call on Adam.
to do
Okay.
or to Adam.
I hereby do that.
Okay, but I also just wanted to
Yeah,
comment
sure.
briefly.
Do
on
finish.
maritime security, which I think what I heard Paul saying is that maybe this is an area where the U.S. and China could think about cooperating, and I think that's a great
Yeah.
idea if we can get there. But
Thank you. So I hereby call on Adam. Yeah, also.
future of OPEC Plus.
All right, so who wants to go? Hey, Kate, go for it, Kate.
Let me make one. I mean, CAPSARC is actually one of the things that I think is often overlooked about OPEC, and CAPSARC has actually written a peer-reviewed Energy Journal published document on this, is that spare capacity actually reduces volatility and adds to global economic growth, right? So and the number that we came up with using various modeling techniques was about $200 billion a year net gain to the global economy because of the spare capacity. So, but back to the panel and other things is why does OPEC have such a hard time getting policymakers here in Washington and elsewhere to recognize that there's a legitimate kind of central banking type function associated with maintaining spare capacity, that cooperation with the Saudis on how and when to employ spare capacity to maintain economic stability is like a useful thing to do. And I'm surprised that we, haven't seen more of an effort on the part of either of the current or the previous administration to work on that.
Kate.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just looking at the oil price, 73. A few things I wanted to say before we get on to OPEC Plus. On China, I've had two governments, European governments, wanting to be briefed about China-GCC relations. And I think Khalid Faleh had some very interesting things to say the other day, the investment minister in Saudi Arabia, about, this is a multipolar world, that we're going to go where our interests lie. And of course, there is a lot of investment flowing. It's no longer just an oil trade relationship. It's more, they've become key investors. They're putting a lot of money. Saudi Arabia, I think, is the biggest recipient of Chinese investment at the moment, and more is coming from that China-Arab business meeting that they recently had. And also the fact that China intervened as a sort of broker between Saudi Arabia and Iran. I mean, it was already underway. The relationship was sort of starting to bubble a little bit. And of course, the Americans can't speak to the Iranians, and therefore China steps in. But do they really want to meddle in regional affairs? I don't think so. I think that was a one-off. Yes, there may be a GCC-Iran meeting that they want to host, but I haven't seen anything about that. But on the OPEC, OECD demand has been in decline. It's been flat. There was a surge in demand because of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. But we've seen, over the years since OPEC Plus was sort of created, it started as this in 2015 when prices were low and the Saudis realized that they really needed to bring Russia on board. And I think they have bent over backwards to accommodate Russia. Russia's not really, they gave them an equal quota with the Saudis when it was quite obvious that they would not be able to produce at that high quota, 11 million barrels a day. we don't really know what the state of the Russian industry is, but we saw also Saudi Arabia agreeing to sort of making this voluntary cut of 1 million barrels a day, giving the UAE a higher baseline. So I think there's a serious effort to keep it together, because at the end of the day, in the old days, OPEC alone had about 40% of the market. Now they have, 29%, maybe 30% at most. They need Russia. And I don't think they can manage the markets the way they've been doing. And yes, spare capacity does weigh on prices. And Russia is selling at a discount. But, at 73 barrels, $73 for Brent, the discount isn't that huge, because they already sell at a discount to Brent anyway.
I mean,
so there's no big loss.
Is that a loss-making price? Does that cover production?
It covers production, but not the budgets of certain countries. Certainly
So
not Iran, not Saudi.
It's a loss price. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sort of. Okay. Great. All right. Sure. Of course.
I mean, personally, I think one of the Russia's great and not well appreciated diplomatic achievements in the last 18 months has been to get the Gulf states to give up market share to the growth markets in Asia to them.
Right.
And I'm not at all convinced that that's a sustainable long-term dynamic.
Probably
given the
not.
importance that these countries have put on that.
Right.
So in terms of the durability of the Russia Plus thing,
Yeah, and Washington has something to say about that too. I mean, not too thrilled. So, Ambassador Roebuck, your comment or question, and
Yes.
we're running out of time, but we'll maybe take the other two together.
I wanted to ask Paul and Hussein, you're welcome to also jump in on this. I was a little surprised, and I just wanted to ask if you agree with Ambassador Herbst's assessment that Russia has not, its influence has not really suffered that much yet in the Gulf from what has happened in the Ukraine. He gave various, sort of reasons for it in his view, but I wonder what your assessment is. The only other point I would make is that I sense that these governments out there, these leaders, are very realpolitik. They look very coldly at realities. And if you look coldly at realities, I mean, Russia has suffered a catastrophic blow in many ways. Anyway, I'd be interested in your assessment of Russian influence in the short and intermediate term.
Personally, I agree with him, because I think despite all that, Russia still has the usefulness that it had before. It wasn't being looked to provide anything that has been exposed as lacking in Ukraine. So it can still do the stuff and provide the leverage and whatnot that I think they wanted, the brokering and all that. Anyway, Paul, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that their influence has increased or decreased in the Gulf. I don't think they had much influence, but I think they came out very well after the invasion of Ukraine, that America's allies in the region did not stand with America, and for them that was a great, a great thing. For the Russians, a great benefit diplomatically. Wouldn't call it influence. And in OPEC Plus, that's a different discussion, and that remains significant. And they're selling at a discount, taking Asian market. It's its own network, as it were, of discussions. But I think what's interesting to watch is the other side of it, which is the Wagner Group, because it's Wagner, which is partly in Syria, certainly in Libya, and then all parts of the Sahel and Africa as well. And it's only 3 days since what happened in Russia. But if indeed Wagner is dissolved and becomes simply part of the Russian official military, would the role that Wagner played around the region, around Africa and other parts of the world, which had an element of deniability for President Putin, so it was a useful tool, like Hezbollah is for Iran, it's not the same thing to have Russian troops in the Sahel or in Africa or in other places. So clearly Wagner is on the decline. What that's going to mean in Syria, what's that's going to mean in other parts of Africa, that's a fast-moving thing, and it does look like it's going downward. And I would imagine Russia would lose a lot of local influence that Wagner built up for it, and that Russia is in no position to recoup or sustain or send new people out there. I think it's going to be a net loss for the Russians. Of course, it's only the third day, so we're getting ahead of ourselves.
I mean, I'm not sure that the Gulf countries loved what Wagner was doing anywhere, frankly, but that's a different story. We've got Ben, and you may end up having the last word here.
Okay.
We're running out.
It's not really on the agenda, but I was wondering if you could talk about India and Gulf perceptions of India. So energy ties have been increasing between the Gulf states and India in recent years. How do they think about India vis-a-vis China as another trade technology partner, like a counterbalance?
I think Professor Murphy is for you. No, you don't know.
I don't look at India deeply.
Oh,
so,
do you know?
No.
Well, I don't look at it deeply or in detail, but it's obvious that for the Gulf, India, is a huge social partner. You know, the biggest community in the Gulf is Indian or South Asian. Historically, they've been part of the Indian sort of expanse. Clearly, India is on the upswing in terms of technology and trade. They're very close. They even have maritime capacities that they're building out. So yeah, it's not an overlooked thing in the Gulf, but in the U.S. we always look at China. What's China doing, and so on. But I think Modi's visit here, and when you dig deeper in the State Department, the Defense Department, they're increasingly aware of the role India plays, obviously globally as part of various alliances and so on, and the Quad and whatnot, but also playing in the Gulf. And I think that's certainly in terms of U.S. policy, that's an area where the U.S. doesn't need to go it alone.
Right.
We haven't talked much about Europe, that many of the Gulf look at Europe as various European countries as a main business and economic and security partner, and India emerging that way as well. So it's not the size of China economically and so on, but yes, India is a big emerging partner for the Gulf.
You know who's going to get the final word? All the way down at the end here.
Yeah,
We're going to get the final word.
Am I audible?
Yes?
Yes, hello. Basically, I have one question that was probably answered before, but I want to point it out again. So my question is, the concept, the Indo-Pacific as a construct that is, although not coined, but at least promoted by the U.S. So my question is, are the U.S. constructs still attractive in the Gulf? We need to talk about the mindset change in the Gulf, and does that change also impact the thinking about the Western constructs? We have to talk about also seeing the U.S.-China competition for the Gulf. Is it a new bipolarity which is visible in the Gulf, at least?
Okay. My answer is yes, but I'm going to let the panelists answer as they like and give their final thoughts.
Well,
do you want to say something?
A quick comment. I mean, in terms of constructs, I think the U.S. and the Gulf are definitely not on the same page. Strategically, the U.S., as I was mentioning, says China and Russia are the enemy. Nobody in the Middle East agrees at all with that construct. Secondly, their construct is democracy good, and everything else is called tyranny or authoritarianism, bad word. And you look at, the UAE, it's pretty good governance in terms of, democracies in the region, Iraq, Lebanon. Democracy in the U.S., is it doing great? No. So that construct is wrong. And we talked a little bit about the rise of India, and instead of looking at it bipolar, that it's us or China, there's Europe, there's India, there's Japan, there's other players. And the world is a multi-layered world. It's not a simple bipolar, you're with this power, with everything, and you're with the others. So the constructs, I think, are really, we're talking past each other. We're not talking the same language.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. And so the last word is going to go to Professor Murphy, and that's so appropriate.
On the Indo-PACOM question, I think that this, again, it's a very fluid situation, and U.S.-India relations also are great. And so to the question on, is it a bipolar system in the region, I think taking a step back, looking at the U.S. and China as being the two primary great powers, but I completely agree with Paul's assessment that countries in the region are looking at a number of global powers, and India is one of those in thinking through what that configuration looks like. I do think it's important to keep in mind on your broader question regarding Indo-PACOM, again, just my views, not Department of Defense, right? India and the U.S. have a number of shared interests, and there's been increasing tension between China and India with some border conflicts. But that said, India, I think, is still incredibly careful in its relations with China as a nuclear-armed neighbor, and that India and China in the Middle East and more broadly in the global South often share more interests as far as sovereignty or the plight of developing countries, et cetera. So I think it's a very complicated relationship, and that India could play a very important role in the future in the Gulf more broadly.
Right, and especially sovereignty as defined as nobody gets to lecture anybody else about their own internal practices. That's a Chinese definition of sovereignty that's very appealing in the Gulf countries. Anyway, thank you so much to our panelists. Thanks to everyone for your attentive participation. And we'll break now and get ready for our keynote.
Hussein, could I just jump in a word? Just remind everybody that when the panel ends, you should move downstairs, and we'll have lunch and the keynote address. Thank you, Hussein, and thank you, Paul and Dawn. It was a great panel.
Thank you so much.